Hello everyone. I know you're looking to use this video to help you sleep better, and I'm here to help you do just that. So just relax and unwind. Before we begin, could you comment and let me know where you're from? What time is it where you are? How was your day? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more stories to come. Now, let's get started. I got home from work around 7 p.m. that evening. It was raining, and the cold wind blew through my coat, making me even more exhausted. Too tired to cook, I decided to order takeout. There's a small Thai restaurant nearby that I often order from, and their delivery service is usually quick, which gave me some peace of mind. I opened the app and ordered a simple meal of tofu pho and a few fried spring rolls, nothing fancy or complicated. About 30 minutes later, I heard a knock at the door. That's quick, I thought, surprised it came sooner than expected. I got up, went to the door, and peered through the peephole. I saw a man in a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just a regular delivery guy. When I opened the door, he handed me a plastic bag, but instead of leaving, he stood there. His face was mostly hidden by the cap, and an uncomfortable feeling started creeping up on me, but I brushed it off. After closing the door, I headed straight to the kitchen. When I opened the bag, I froze. Instead of food, there were crumpled, old newspapers stuffed inside. Confusion turned into unease. Was this just a mistake? I picked up my phone to call the restaurant, but before I could dial, there was another knock at the door, this time louder, more urgent, like someone in a hurry. The knock shattered the calm, sending chills down my spine. I stood still for a moment, my heart racing. A sense of danger washed over me. Despite my better judgment, I opened the door again, and there he was, the same delivery man, but now empty-handed. He stood there, his cold eyes fixed on me beneath his hat. I asked, "Where's my food?" but he didn't answer. Instead, he stepped inside. I backed away, feeling my heart pound in my chest. He said nothing, just looked around the room as if searching for something. His presence violated everything in my apartment, from my keys to the family photo on the table. My heart was beating wildly as I tried to shout for him to leave, but the words got stuck in my throat. He finally looked at me, and for the first time, I saw his eyes, cold, hollow, devoid of any humanity. A twisted smile crept across his face, but it wasn't friendly. It was as if he found something amusing, as if he enjoyed my fear. He stepped back a few paces, but instead of leaving, he just stood there, staring at me, as if trying to burn this image into my memory forever. I was startled by a faint sound, the ringing of my phone. Instinct told me to run and grab it from the counter, but my legs felt frozen to the ground. When I turned around, the man was gone. The front door was slightly ajar, as if no one had ever entered. I rushed to the door, locked it, my hands trembling so much that it took several tries to turn the key. When I called the restaurant, they told me no delivery had been dispatched, and my food was still being prepared. Fear washed over me. I called the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing, no footprints, no fingerprints. It was as if everything had been a hallucination. But I knew the man was real. His cold smile and those lifeless eyes would haunt me forever. Since that day, I haven't dared to return to my apartment. I live in constant fear, feeling like he's still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to return, and I don't know what will happen when he does. The knock in the night, the chilling smile, and those hollow eyes. I can't escape them. One late evening, I found myself finishing up a report at the office, the clock barely ticking past 9 p.m. The building was eerily quiet, the hum of the air conditioning punctuating the stillness, accompanied only by the occasional rustle of papers. The atmosphere felt almost oppressive, a weight pressing down as I typed the last few lines. Once I finally hit send, I exhaled in relief, eager to leave the desolate office behind. I packed my things and made my way to the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the vacant hallway. I pressed the button and waited, glancing at my watch, counting the seconds until I could escape. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and I stepped inside, thankful to be one step closer to home. As the doors began to close, a man suddenly rushed in. At first glance, he appeared disheveled, his clothes were wrinkled, stained, and slightly disheveled as if he had just run a long distance. His eyes were wide, filled with a frantic energy that set off alarm bells in my mind. I turned my gaze to the illuminated floor numbers, trying to ignore the strange sense of unease creeping over me. Then, the elevator jolted violently, and the lights flickered out. Panic gripped me as darkness enveloped us for a heartbeat. My breath quickened, and a cold sweat formed on my brow. When the lights returned, I froze at the sight before me. The man's hands were smeared with dark, crimson stains. Not just a trace, there was an alarming amount of it. My heart raced as I struggled to find words. I wanted to ask if he was all right, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. The man seemed to sense my distress, his eyes locked onto mine, wide and unblinking, the fear in his gaze mirroring my own. It was as if he was lost in his own world, completely unmoored. The elevator shuddered again and stopped, the emergency lights buzzing overhead. He took a deep breath, and I noticed his hands trembling. He glanced around the small space, then back at me, as if searching for something. "Is everything okay?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper, my throat dry and constricted. He stared at me, his eyes darting as if he was grappling with a haunting memory. The silence in the elevator felt unbearable, thick like fog. I fought the urge to press the emergency button, my fingers felt heavy, paralyzed by fear. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice trembling. "They're coming. They'll find me." My pulse quickened. "Who's coming?" I whispered, a knot forming in my stomach. The dread in his expression deepened, and he didn't respond. Instead, he began to pace in the confined space, his bloodied hands flailing as he moved. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to put as much distance between us as possible, my mind racing to concoct a plan. What had he done? Who was chasing him? The questions tormented me, and I felt the walls closing in. The elevator lurched again, and the lights flickered more violently this time. A faint noise echoed above us, a whisper of voices. My heart sank further. I fumbled for the emergency button, but it remained unresponsive, the dread pooling in my stomach. The man's breathing became ragged and erratic. He seemed to spiral into a panic, muttering to himself in a desperate, frantic tone. I couldn't catch the words, but the tone was unmistakably alarmed. My instincts screamed at me to escape, but the elevator was stuck, the door a solid barrier between us and the outside world. Suddenly, the man stopped and turned to me, eyes wide as if he was about to reveal something critical. But instead, he collapsed against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the floor, breathing heavily as if he had run a marathon. I took a deep breath, trying to quell my rising fear. Time felt suspended, and I waited in tense silence, hoping to hear more from outside the elevator. Moments later, faint voices reached my ears, growing louder as they approached. My heart leaped with hope, a flicker of relief breaking through the fear. Finally, the elevator doors began to open slowly, a sliver of light spilling in. A group of paramedics stood there, their faces a mixture of concern and urgency. They quickly assessed the scene, the men crumpled on the floor, hands still covered in blood, and me, trembling but alive. One of the paramedics rushed inside to check on him while another stepped forward to help me out. I pointed at the men, my voice shaky, "He needs help." They moved quickly, their professionalism evident as they took control of the situation. I stumbled out into the hallway, breathing in the fresh air as I left the oppressive confines of the elevator behind. Later, I learned that the man had been involved in a violent altercation, his bloodied hands the grim evidence of his desperate escape. The police handled everything from there. Sometimes, I still think about that night, the feeling of being trapped in an elevator with an unstable stranger, the uncertainty of what could have happened next. It's a memory that lingers, haunting in its vividness, a reminder of how quickly the ordinary can turn into something terrifying. I can never shake the fear of that night, the shadows of the unknown lingering in the back of my mind, a chilling echo of what it means to feel utterly trapped. I had settled in to prepare for bed on a late evening, just like any other day in my small apartment in New York. I was tired after a long day at work and wanted to relax. The noise of the city outside, ambulance sirens, distant voices, and the sound of traffic, was something I had grown accustomed to. Despite the chaos, it provided a sense of safety, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this vast city. Around 11:30 p.m., my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I usually don't answer calls from unknown numbers, but this time something compelled me to pick up. On the other end was a man's voice, trembling and gasping. He kept repeating, they're coming, you need to leave now." I was startled, but I still thought it might just be a prank or someone calling the wrong number. I told him he had dialed the wrong person and hung up, trying to return to my routine. About 10 minutes later, the phone rang again, still the same number. I hesitated for a moment but decided to answer. The man's voice on the other end was now more frantic, almost shouting, "Listen to me, they're coming for you. You need to leave right now." I could hear his labored breathing, as if he were running or hiding. At that moment, I started to feel a chill down my spine, but I still tried to convince myself it was just a bizarre joke. I hung up again, but the feeling of unease lingered. I turned on the TV to distract myself, but my gaze kept drifting back to the phone, waiting for another call. And then it rang again. This time, I didn't answer and let it go to voicemail. The call stopped, but just a minute later, I received a notification for a new voicemail. I hesitated for a moment before pressing play. The message was very brief, but his voice was filled with terror. "They've arrived, you don't have much time, they're coming up, hide now." My heart began to race. This was no longer a joke, it felt all too real. I stood up, looking around my apartment. I was alone, but now I felt like I was being watched, threatened. I walked to the front door and checked the lock, then checked again. As I stood there, my phone rang once more, and my stomach dropped. I didn't want to answer, but a part of me felt compelled to do so. Before I could say anything, I heard a noise from the other side. The door creaked, footsteps approached, and then a whisper, "They're almost here." The call abruptly cut off. An indescribable fear urged me to look through the peephole. I leaned in close, trying to steady my breathing. At first, I saw nothing but an empty hallway. But then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, gradually getting closer to my door. I stood still, listening as they came nearer, then stopped right in front of my door. I dared not look again. The world outside seemed eerily silent. I slowly backed away from the door, trying not to make a sound. My apartment was small, leaving little room to hide. My heart raced, and my mind spun as I thought about what to do. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, the only thing that made me feel slightly safer. I retreated to the corner of the living room where I could see part of the front door while still hiding in the shadows. I waited, gripping the knife so tightly it hurt. Every tiny sound in the building startled me. Then I heard it, a very faint sound, almost unnoticeable, the sound of something scraping against the door. Someone was trying to unlock my front door. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, standing still as stone. The scraping stopped, and then the doorknob began to jiggle. I stared at it, my body frozen in terror as I watched the knob slowly turn. Fortunately, the deadbolt was locked, and the door didn't open. However, the intruders outside weren't giving up. I heard them mumbling, but their words were too quiet to make out. My heart raced so loudly I thought they might hear it from outside. My mind raced with questions. Who were they? Why were they after me? Who was the caller, and how did he know? I continued to stand frozen, trying to remain calm. Then the silence was broken by another set of footsteps. There was more than one person outside. Two voices began to argue, their tones low but urgent. One of them said, "We need to hurry." At that moment, I realized I didn't have much time left. If they got in, I wouldn't stand a chance. My body was tense with sheer fear, but I knew I had to do something quickly. Suddenly, I remembered the emergency exit outside the bedroom window. That was my only chance. I slowly moved, trying not to make a sound as I backed toward the bedroom. The noises from the living room now felt distant, even though they were very close. They tried to open the door again, this time more forcefully, and I heard the door creaking under pressure. I knew I didn't have much time. Once in the bedroom, I went straight to the window. My heart pounded so hard I felt like it might burst. I gently opened the window, praying it wouldn't creak. The window opened, and a cold draft rushed in. I tightly gripped the knife and began to climb out through the emergency exit. Just as my foot landed on the metal rungs, I heard the front door of my apartment burst open. They were inside. I had no choice but to climb down quickly. I moved as fast as I could on the metal steps, my hands shaking from fear and cold. Voices echoed inside the apartment, they were looking for me. I was just a few meters from the ground when I heard the bedroom door swing open. I looked up and saw two men standing in the doorway, their cold eyes fixated on me. They didn't say anything, they just stared like predators that had spotted their prey. I continued to climb down, my heart pounding in my chest. When my feet hit the ground, I started running, not daring to look back. My footsteps echoed in the dark alley, and I only stopped when I saw the bright lights of the main road and heard the voices of strangers on the street. At that moment, I let out a sigh of relief and pulled out my phone, trembling as I called the police. The police arrived shortly after, but when we returned to the apartment, they had vanished. My front door was broken, and the apartment was in disarray, but nothing had been taken. The officer said it might have been a burglary, but I knew better. They hadn't come to steal, they had come for me. Someone had warned me, but I would never know who it was or how they knew those intruders would come. Since that night, I could no longer feel safe in my own apartment. I moved away a few months later, but the fear still clung to me, refusing to fade. I would never forget the feeling of standing by the bedroom window and the gaze of those two strangers. They had come for me, and to this day, I still don't know why. After I moved, I thought the fear would gradually diminish. But every time darkness fell, a sense of unease washed over me. Strange dreams plagued me, sometimes filled with footsteps outside my door, other times with whispers on the phone. In my dreams, I always found myself standing before the door of my old apartment, hands trembling, hearing the sound of the door creaking as someone tried to unlock it. And then, when the door swung open, I would see two shadowy figures standing there, staring at me with haunting eyes. Each time I woke up, drenched in cold sweat, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that even when I was awake, I didn't feel at peace. For months after moving into my new apartment, I constantly felt like someone was watching me. When I stepped outside, I would often subconsciously look around, searching for a strange figure in the crowd. Whenever my phone rang, my heart would race, fearing I would hear the trembling voice warning me once more. Every small sound, from the creak of a window to footsteps in the hallway, startled me. I tried to convince myself that it was all over. That those intruders couldn't find me at my new address, that I had escaped that danger. But a part of me couldn't believe it. Sometimes, when I walked into my new apartment after a long day at work, I would feel that strange sensation returning, an inexplicable unease, just like that night when I discovered my favorite mug had been moved. The only difference was that this time, I hadn't noticed anything changed in the apartment, but I always had the feeling that someone had been there before me. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone suddenly vibrated. I looked at the screen and realized it was another unknown number. My stomach twisted with fear. I didn't answer, instead, I let it go to voicemail. When the voicemail notification came in, I sat frozen, hesitating whether to listen or not. Finally, I gathered my courage and pressed play. That familiar trembling voice echoed, "They're coming again. This time, don't run." I threw my phone to the floor in panic. A sense of numbness enveloped me. What did that mean? Was I not supposed to run this time? Were they coming for me again? Suddenly, there was a soft knock on my front door, and I felt fear clearer than ever before. Who was standing out there? I didn't want to know. But deep down, I realized this wasn't the end. They were still looking for me. And this time, I wasn't sure I would escape. The overwhelming sense of terror rendered me motionless, my eyes glued to the door. The gentle knocking echoed again, steady like the slow beating of my heart, but the sound grew clearer, as if the person on the other side was waiting for me to respond. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but all my senses were stretched to the limit. A thought flashed through my mind: if I open the door this time, what will await me? I stood up, my hands trembling as I reached for the knife from the dining table, just like before. My heart pounded as I approached the door, my legs feeling heavy with each step. The sounds outside completely faded away, leaving only a deathly silence. I crouched down to look through the peephole, but all I saw was an empty hallway. No one was there. I swallowed hard and stepped back, wondering if I was imagining all of this. But something inside me said this wasn't a hallucination. They had come. I turned to lock the door again, but another noise made me stop. A faint sound came from behind me, from inside the apartment. I turned my head, my eyes following the direction of the noise towards the bedroom, where it originated. It was a whisper, like fabric rubbing together or a soft breath in the dark. No way. I had checked all the locks on the doors and windows. How could anyone have gotten in? I must be imagining it. But my feet instinctively led me closer to the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and a part of me wanted to run from this place, but curiosity, and the fear of being watched, pushed me forward. Standing before the bedroom door, I held my breath and gently pushed it open. The room was pitch dark, but the light from the hallway was enough for me to realize something was off. The bedroom window was still closed, the curtains were silent. But the air in the room felt heavier. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something, or someone, was present in the darkness. I scanned the room, seeing nothing unusual. But as my gaze swept past the closet, I heard it, a small but distinct sound of something shifting lightly. The whisper I had heard before. I felt a cold shiver down my back, and immediately memories from before flooded back. The sight of opening the closet and seeing a stranger lurking, the one who had lunged at me. My grip tightened on the knife, and my breaths became shorter, more frantic. Had they gotten in? Had they snuck in here while I wasn't paying attention? This time, I didn't wait. I shoved the closet door open. It creaked as it swung wide. But inside, it was empty. I let out a sigh of relief, my heart racing but feeling slightly calmer. I was panicking over nothing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after everything that had happened. I closed the closet and turned to head back to bed to rest. But then, from the corner of the room, I heard laughter, soft, low, and haunting. A strange laughter I had never heard before, but it echoed in the space as if it belonged to this room for a long time. My body froze. I turned around, staring into the corner of the room, where the light from the hallway didn't reach, just thick darkness. And in that darkness, eyes were staring straight at me. I stood frozen, unable to believe my eyes. Those eyes, cold and soulless, like two black stones, were staring at me from the dark corner of the room. A wave of panic surged, paralyzing me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The soft laughter echoed again, this time clearer, like a mocking, haunting sound. I raised the knife instinctively, knowing it wouldn't help. "Do you think you can escape?" A whispering voice rang out from the darkness. The sound was low, as if it was speaking from deep inside my mind. "We have always been here. From the very beginning, we have been waiting for you." I took a step back, my breath quickening, trying to steady myself. Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling, but there was no response. Instead, the darkness began to move. No, not darkness, it was a shadow, a figure gradually stepping out from the corner of the room. It was tall, but its shape was indistinct, as if made from the very night itself. I took a deep breath, trying to regain my composure, but my heart raced as if it could explode. "I don't know who you are, but you can't do anything to me," I shouted, my voice a mix of defiance and fear. The figure didn't answer, but it continued to approach, slowly yet surely. Then, other sounds emerged from behind me, footsteps, many footsteps, as if a group of people were entering my apartment. My heart nearly stopped. I turned around, and in front of me, the bedroom door stood wide open. In the dim light of the hallway, I saw other shapes, not human, but shadows similar to the entity in the room. They glided silently, but their presence made the air thick and cold. "Don't resist," that voice echoed again, this time sounding closer, as if it were right next to me. "We have found you, and this time, you cannot escape." I recoiled, but an invisible hand grabbed my shoulder, pulling me closer. I felt its cold breath on my skin. In a moment of desperation, I lunged the knife forward, but it sliced only through the air. Those entities had no physical form for me to fight against. "No, it can't be," I whispered, almost praying. But deep down, I knew I was wrong. They had caught up with me. And this time, there was no escape. The laughter hissed one last time before the darkness completely swallowed me. And then, everything faded into nothingness. The rain was falling heavily as I left the office that evening. The storm had been brewing all day, and now it had turned into a downpour. I rushed to my car, huddling under my umbrella, and saw Tom standing by the entrance. He looked soaked even though he was wearing a raincoat. "Need a ride?" I called out. Tom smiled, looking relieved. "Thanks, Rachel, I appreciate it." He climbed into the passenger seat, and I turned on the air conditioning. We chatted about work while I drove on the slick roads. The rain was so heavy that visibility was reduced to just a few feet. The windshield wipers were working at full speed but barely improved the view. We came to a red light, and I glanced at Tom. He seemed tense, tapping his fingers rhythmically on his knee. "Is everything okay?" I asked. He nodded but didn't say anything. When the light turned green, I started driving again. A few blocks later, I realized Tom was no longer in the car. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard the door open or felt any movement. I pulled over, panic rising in my chest. How could he have disappeared like that? I stepped outside, calling his name. The relentless rain soaked me within seconds. There was no sign of him. I returned to the car, my mind racing. Had he jumped out? Why hadn't I heard anything? I decided to go back to the office, thinking he might have returned there for some reason. When I arrived, the building was dark and locked. I knocked on the door, hoping the night security guard might have seen something, but no one answered. I felt so alone. I drove around the area, circling the blocks near where he had vanished, but saw no sign of Tom. Feeling desperate, I called the police. They said they would send someone to take a report, but their tone suggested they thought he might have simply decided to walk home. I sat in the car, shivering from the cold and fear. Something was very wrong. I decided to head to Tom's apartment, hoping he might be there. When I got there, his lights were off. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. As I turned to leave, a figure stepped out from the shadows. I gasped, recognizing one of Tom's neighbors. He looked at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Are you looking for Tom?" he asked. I nodded. "Have you seen him?" He shook his head. "Not since this morning." "Is something wrong?" I explained what had happened, and he looked even more worried. "Tom has been acting strange lately," he mentioned, feeling like he was being followed, but I thought it was just work stress. The rain continued to pour as I returned to my car. My phone rang, and I saw it was an unknown number. I hesitated but answered the call. "Rachel," a voice said. It was Tom, but he sounded terrified. "Tom, where are you?" I was running out of time. "Don't trust them," he whispered. The line went dead. My hands trembled as I tried to call back, but it only went to voicemail. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't go to the police. They wouldn't believe me. I drove around, trying to piece together what little I knew. My thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a black car that seemed to be following me. Every time I turned, it was right behind me. Panic surged. I sharply turned down a narrow street and accelerated, hoping to lose it. My heart raced as I navigated the slippery roads. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the car still tailing me. I drove toward the outskirts of the city, hoping the winding roads would help me evade them. The car remained persistent in its pursuit. I spotted a narrow dirt road and turned onto it, the vehicle bouncing over the rough terrain. The road led into a dense forest, the trees closing in around me as the headlights of the car behind disappeared. I continued driving until I found a small clearing, then turned off the engine and lights, hoping they wouldn't find me. I sat there in the dark, the rain pounding on the roof, trying to calm my racing heart. I had to figure out what was happening and why Tom had vanished. I couldn't go home. After what had occurred, it wasn't safe. After what felt like hours, the rain finally began to let up. I decided to head back to the city, keeping an eye on the road behind me. I needed answers, and the only place I could think of was Tom's apartment. When I arrived, the building was dark and quiet. I slipped in through a side door I knew was always left unlocked. I stealthily made my way to Tom's apartment and unlocked it, a skill I had learned years ago and never thought I would need. Inside, it was a mess, papers strewn everywhere, looking as if someone had been searching for something. I found Tom's laptop on the table and opened it, hoping to find a clue. As I sifted through his files, I came across a folder labeled "Danger." Inside were documents and images detailing some kind of conspiracy. There were photos of people I recognized from around town, notes about meetings, and lists of names. It all related to some illegal activities Tom had uncovered. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside the door. I quickly closed the laptop and hid behind the couch. The door creaked open, and I saw a pair of boots step inside. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The person moved around the apartment, rummaging through the clutter. After what felt like an eternity, they left, and I heard the door lock behind them. I waited a few minutes before emerging from my hiding spot. I grabbed Tom's laptop and snuck out of the apartment, returning to my car. I needed to find a safe place to go through the documents and determine who I could trust. I drove to a nearby motel and registered under a fake name. In the safety of my room, I opened the laptop once more and reviewed everything. It was clear that Tom had uncovered something huge, and now we were both targets. I knew I had to get this information to someone who could help, but I had to be careful. I spent the rest of the night copying the files and sending them to trusted contacts, hoping they would take it seriously. As dawn approached, I felt a little safer. The storm had passed, but I knew the danger wasn't over. I had to stay hidden until I could be sure the information had been disseminated and Tom was safe. The following days passed in a blur of confusion and fear. I moved from place to place, never staying in one spot for too long. I heard from one of my contacts that the information had leaked to the press and authorities were investigating. Finally, I received a call from Tom. He was safe, hiding out in another city. He thanked me for my help, and we agreed to keep everything under wraps until things settled down. It took several months for everything to calm down, but eventually, those behind the conspiracy were arrested, and things began to return to normal. I never saw Tom again, but we kept in touch through encrypted messages. That rainy night changed everything. I learned to be more cautious, to trust my instincts, and to always be aware of my surroundings. Last night was unusual. I was working as a security guard in a large office building downtown. Normally, the place is quite quiet. I patrol, check the cameras, and ensure everything is locked up. But last night, something happened that I still can't forget. It was around 1 a.m. when I received a call on the building's emergency line, a direct line reserved for true emergencies. I answered immediately. The voice of a woman on the other end was trembling and filled with fear. She said she was being held hostage somewhere in the building. I asked her where she was, trying to remain calm. She replied that she didn't know exactly but described a windowless room with a heavy door. Confusion washed over me. I knew this building like the back of my hand and couldn't think of any such room. I told her to stay quiet and that I would find her. I grabbed my flashlight and began checking each floor, starting from the ground up. Each floor was empty, just dark offices and locked doors. I kept my phone close, hoping she would call back with more information. When I reached the top floor, chills ran down my spine. It was supposed to be vacant, no businesses, no offices, just storage. Yet the woman's voice was hauntingly clear and desperate. I checked every storage room, but they were all empty. I returned to the security room to review the cameras, rewinding the footage to look for anything unusual. That's when I spotted something strange on one of the cameras. I saw a shadow moving in the hallway on the top floor. It was quick but undeniably there. My heart raced as I stepped back. I checked the hallway where I saw the shadow, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. I began to doubt myself, thinking maybe I had imagined it, but then I heard a faint sound, like a door creaking. I followed the sound to a wall at the end of the hallway. It looked like an ordinary wall, but when I pressed against it, it moved, a hidden door. I couldn't believe it. I pushed it open and found a dark staircase leading down. Taking a deep breath, I descended the stairs. At the bottom was a heavy metal door, just like the woman had described. I knocked gently and called out to her. She answered immediately, her voice filled with relief. I told her to back away and try the doorknob. It was locked. I glanced around and saw a keypad on the wall. I had no idea what the code could be. I asked her if she knew, but she said the kidnappers always entered the code too quickly for her to see. I had to think fast. I remembered seeing a keypad in the security room with a list of default codes for emergencies. I told her I would be right back and rushed up the stairs. My legs felt heavy as lead as I ran to the office. I found the list and hurried back down. I tried the first code, nothing. The second code, still nothing. On the third attempt, the door clicked open. I pushed it aside and saw her tied to a chair in the middle of the room. She looked terrified but unarmed. I rushed over and untied her. She thanked me repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. I told her we needed to get out of there. We hurried up the stairs and into the hallway just as the kidnappers were returning. As we reached the main hallway, I heard voices. The kidnappers were coming back. I led her into a nearby office, and we hid inside, holding our breath. The voices grew louder and then stopped right outside the door. I could see shadows moving beneath the door. They were searching for her. My heart pounded so hard I was sure they could hear it, but after a few tense minutes, they passed by. We waited a little longer and then ventured out. We made it to the ground floor and exited through the main door. I called the police as soon as we were outside. They arrived quickly and took the woman to safety. They searched the building but found no sign of the kidnappers. They had vanished. The police questioned me for hours. I told them everything I knew, but many questions remained. Who were these people? Why had she been taken, and how did they know the building so well? That night, I didn't get any answers. I went home, exhausted and shaken. I couldn't sleep, replaying everything in my mind, the woman's voice, the hidden door, the shadows under the door. It all felt like a nightmare. Today, I'm still trying to process it all. The building feels different now, less secure. I keep thinking about that woman and what she went through. I'm just grateful I was there to help, even if I don't have all the answers. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe again, but I know one thing: I will always trust my instincts. If I hadn't answered that call, no one knows what could have happened to her. I checked into a hotel outside Baton Rouge. The air was thick with humidity, and I was exhausted after a day of driving. There was nothing special about the place, just a one-story building with faded light blue paint and a flickering sign, but it was cheap, and that was all I cared about at the moment. The woman at the front desk barely looked up when I handed her my card. She gave me the room key and pointed down the hallway without saying a word. The room was quite small, just a bed, a wall-mounted TV, and a bathroom that smelled slightly of bleach. I dropped my bag on the floor and flopped onto the bed, too tired to think about finding somewhere else to stay. After a quick shower, I climbed into bed, mindlessly scrolling through my phone. The room was quiet except for the distant noise of traffic on the highway. I felt uneasy but told myself it was just the unfamiliar environment. I had been driving for hours, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Around midnight, I heard the first knock. It wasn't loud, just a gentle tapping like someone lightly rapping their fingers against wood. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the hotel had been nearly empty when I checked in. I waited, hoping it was just a mistake, but the knocking continued, this time more insistently. I got out of bed, my feet sinking into the thin carpet, and slowly walked to the door. I pressed my eye against the peephole but only saw darkness. No one was there. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I hesitated, unsure whether to open the door, finally convincing myself that it was nothing, probably just some kids playing pranks, and I turned back to bed. But less than 5 minutes later, the knocking came again, this time louder and more urgent. I sprang up from the bed, my heart racing. I knew I should ignore it, but something inside me wanted to confront whoever was outside. I threw the blanket off and stepped toward the door, this time flinging it open without looking through the peephole. The hallway was empty, no one in sight, the only sound the faint buzzing of the overhead light flickering as if it might go out at any moment. I stepped into the hallway, glancing left and right but seeing nothing. The other doors were tightly shut, and the place was eerily quiet. I closed the door and locked it tightly, checking the safety chain again. I tried to go back to bed to sleep but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My nerves were on edge, and every small sound made me jump. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sign of movement. Just as I was starting to drift off, the knocking came again, this time different, slow, deliberate, as if someone was intentionally provoking me. I gritted my teeth, trying to force myself to lie still in bed, but the sound kept repeating, persistent and infuriating. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, and rushed to the door, but before I could open it, I noticed something. A small piece of paper had been slipped under the door, barely visible in the dim light. I picked it up, my hands shaking. The paper was old, the edges yellowed as if it had been crumpled and flattened out again. There were words scrawled on it, messy and hurried, as if the writer was in a rush. It was just my name, nothing else, no message, no explanation, just my name. A chill ran down my spine. I looked at the door and then back at the paper, my mind spinning. How did they know my name? I hadn't talked to anyone other than the woman at the front desk, and she didn't seem like the type to pull pranks. I peered through the peephole again, but the hallway was still empty. I stood there for a long time, feeling like forever, trying to figure out what to do. Every instinct told me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, my mind racing with possibilities. Was someone watching me? Had they followed me since I checked in? The thought made me shudder. Finally, I forced myself to act. I opened my bag, shoving my belongings in as quickly as I could, my hands trembling so much that I could barely zip it shut. I knew I had to get out of there, but the thought of opening the door again sent shivers down my spine. I reached for the doorknob when the knocking started again, this time louder, almost frenzied, as if they were trying to break down the door. I stumbled back, dropping my bag and running into the bathroom. I locked the door behind me, my heart pounding in my ears. I sat on the edge of the tub, trying to control my breathing. The knocking continued, relentless and terrifying. I stared at the bathroom door, half hoping it would burst open at any moment. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I wasn't safe. Eventually, the knocking stopped, and the silence that followed was even worse. I waited, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing, just a stifling, suffocating silence. I was in the bathroom for hours, too scared to move. When I finally mustered the courage to leave, I tiptoed out of the bathroom, my eyes fixed on the door. There was no sound, no sign of anyone outside. The piece of paper with my name still lay on the floor where I had dropped it, a stark reminder of how real everything was. I picked up my bag and rushed to the door. This time, I didn't check the hallway, I just ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring as I drove out of the parking lot. I didn't look back, not wanting to know if anyone was watching me leave. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between myself and that motel. I drove for hours, my mind replaying the events of that night. I got off the bus, thinking it was the right stop. Dusk had fallen, and the light was fading quickly, only to realize I had made a mistake. The bus rolled away, kicking up dust, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing around, just the empty road stretching out in both directions, no buildings, no streetlights, nothing. I checked my phone for a map, but there was no signal. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I could walk to the next stop or find a town ahead. It couldn't be that far, could it? But as I began to walk, a sense of dread welled up inside me. The road was too quiet, devoid of vehicles, no sounds at all, just the echo of my footsteps on the pavement. I kept walking, hoping to see some sign of life soon. After a while, I heard a vehicle approaching from behind. I turned around, initially feeling relieved, thinking I could hitch a ride, but as the vehicle got closer, it slowed down. It didn't pass me, it just moved at my walking pace. I couldn't see who was driving, the headlights too bright, blinding me. I tried to ignore it, thinking they might just be cautious, but that feeling was wrong. My instincts screamed. I quickened my pace, hoping they would get bored and drive away, but the vehicle stayed right behind me. That was when the real fear began. I glanced over my shoulder again, and the vehicle was still there, following me like a shadow. I decided to speed up, my heart racing in my chest. The vehicle continued to tail me, the engine humming as it rolled alongside me. I thought about running, but the road was too open, nowhere to hide, just the vast desert on either side. If I ran, they could easily catch up. I tried to think of another plan, but my mind was spinning, unable to focus. Suddenly, the vehicle accelerated and cut in front of me. The door opened, and I saw a man step out. He was tall, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He stood there for a moment just staring at me, and I froze. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He called out to me, his voice too calm, asking if I needed a ride. I shook my head, trying to keep my distance, but he stepped closer. I said I was fine, that I was just going to keep walking, but it seemed he didn't care about what I was saying. There was something in his tone that sent chills down my spine. I backed away, and that was when he lunged at me. I turned and ran as fast as I could. I heard him yell something, but I didn't stop to listen. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I kept running, too afraid to look back. The roar of the engine was right behind me. I knew he was chasing me, tires screeching as he tried to catch up. I veered off the road, tripping into the desert, hoping the uneven terrain would slow him down. The ground was rough, rocks and bushes tripping me up, but I didn't stop. I could hear the vehicle crashing through the brush, headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. I spotted a small hill ahead and ran toward it, my only thought to get out of sight. I climbed over the rocks, my hands scraping against sharp edges, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I threw myself down behind a large boulder, trying to catch my breath, praying he hadn't seen where I had hidden. I could hear the vehicle stop nearby, the engine still running. I held my breath, my body trembling with fear. The silence stretched on, and I could hear footsteps crunching on gravel. He was searching for me. I pressed myself against the rock, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps got closer, and I shut my eyes tight, terrified he would find me. He came very close, I could hear his breathing, the gravel shifting beneath his feet, but then he stopped. I didn't move, didn't dare to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, I heard him mumble something and then the footsteps receded. The car door slammed, and the engine roared as he drove away. I waited, scared to believe it was over. I hid behind the rock until I could no longer hear the vehicle, until the silence of the desert enveloped me. Only then did I dare to breathe again. I knew I couldn't stay there forever, I needed to find help, a way out of this nightmare. But as I stood up and started to walk, every shadow seemed a threat, every noise made me jump. The road remained silent, stretching endlessly before me, and I felt utterly alone. It took hours of walking before I finally saw headlights in the distance. This time, it wasn't an old vehicle. A pickup truck slowed down as it approached, and I waved, desperately needing help. The driver rolled down the window, an older man with kind eyes asking if I needed a ride. I hesitated for a moment before climbing into the truck. As we drove away, I kept looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see that vehicle chasing me again, but it never appeared. It was a night like any other, except for the rain relentlessly pounding against the windows. I was working late in my home office, trying to finish a project that was behind schedule. The storm outside was so loud it drowned out all other sounds, making it hard to concentrate. Lightning occasionally illuminated the room before being swallowed by darkness. Around midnight, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. Usually, I wouldn't answer, but I was waiting for a call from a client, so I picked up, and the voice on the other end sounded rough, almost distorted by static. "Jenna," the voice said, "I know what you did." My heart stopped. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, then the voice continued, "You don't need to pretend, you know exactly what I'm talking about." A chill ran down my spine. I had no idea who this person was or what they were referring to. "You must have the wrong number," I said. The voice laughed, a harsh and mocking sound. "Don't play games with me, I know about the emails you sent. I know about your secret meetings." I had never sent any emails I shouldn't have, and there were no secret meetings. I felt a rising sense of fear. "Listen, I don't know what you're talking about, I'm hanging up now." Before I could do so, the call ended. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I tried to call back, but the number was disconnected. I felt uneasy but tried to brush it off. It could just be a prank, but then the calls kept coming. Each time I answered, the caller would say something nonsensical or repeat vague threats. They knew details about my life, my work, my habits, even the names of a few friends. It was unsettling, to say the least. I tried to trace the calls, but the number always showed as blocked or unavailable. My attempts to block the number were futile, they just kept calling from different numbers. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. After an hour of this, I noticed something strange. Occasionally I saw a dark figure moving past the window when lightning flashed. I tried to dismiss it as the rain's effects or my imagination, but as the night wore on, the fear only intensified. I decided to check outside. I carefully peeked through the curtain, trying not to draw attention. The rain was pouring so heavily that visibility was nearly zero. I saw no one, but the feeling that someone was out there, lurking in the darkness, became almost palpable. I turned back inside, trying to calm myself. I locked all the doors and windows, but the calls kept coming. The caller seemed to be relishing my fear, taunting me with personal details and saying my time was running out. I knew I had to do something. I called the police, but they told me to stay on the line and update them if anything happened. They said they would send someone as soon as they could, but it might take time due to the storm. I felt alone, abandoned, and vulnerable. Suddenly, a loud bang came from the back of the house. I jumped, my heart racing. I grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat for protection. The lights flickered out, and I knew the storm was causing disruptions. I stepped outside through the back door, shining the flashlight ahead. The rain fell so hard it was difficult to see anything. I carefully opened the door and stepped out, the mud sinking beneath my feet. The backyard was empty, but I noticed a muddy footprint leading from the edge of the yard to the back door. They looked fresh, and the sight sent a chill down my spine. I quickly returned inside, locked the door, and called the police again to report the footprints. They promised someone would be there soon. I sat in the office, waiting, fear making it hard to concentrate. The calls had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. I felt like a sitting duck, waiting for something terrible to happen. After what felt like hours, there was a knock at the door. I hesitated but finally opened it to find 2 police officers standing there, soaked from the rain. They came in and began to investigate, checking around the area and asking me about the calls and any suspicious activity. As they spoke with me, I felt a bit of relief, but the fear never fully left. They thoroughly checked the area but found no one. They took down details about the calls and the muddy footprints, promising to keep an eye on the situation. After they left, I locked the door and tried to get some sleep. I left a light on and kept my phone close, ready to call for help if needed. The storm continued to rage outside, but eventually exhaustion overcame me, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the sun was out. The police had reported no incidents from the night before. The uneasy feeling of being watched began to fade, but I knew I would be more cautious from now on. The calls finally stopped, and I heard nothing more from the mysterious caller. I rented a cabin in Vermont for the weekend, hoping to find some peace and solitude away from it all. Nestled deep in the woods, it was wonderfully secluded. When I arrived, it looked just like the photos, small yet cozy, with a large fireplace and windows letting in plenty of light. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. The first day was lovely. I settled in, brewed a cup of coffee, and read by the fire. The only sounds were the crackling flames and the wind outside, making me feel like I was the last person on earth. That night, I went to bed early. The bed was comfortable and the cabin warm, but I couldn't fall asleep right away. I kept hearing noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe some animals moving through the woods, since the forest was alive with sounds. But these noises were strange, slow and deliberate, like footsteps. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or something similar, but it was hard to ignore. Eventually, I dozed off, scolding myself for being so foolish. The next morning, I felt a bit embarrassed about how anxious I had been. I made breakfast and decided to take a walk around the property to clear my head. The air was fresh, and everything was quiet, as if the world had been muted. But as I strolled, I noticed something that made my stomach drop: muddy footprints leading up to the cabin. They weren't mine. I hadn't stepped outside into the mud since I arrived, and these prints were fresh. They led straight to the back door and stopped there. I stared at them for a moment, my mind racing to understand where they had come from. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been outside the cabin last night, right beside me. The thought sent chills down my spine. I hurried back inside and locked the door behind me, trying to stay calm and telling myself there had to be a logical explanation, maybe a lost hiker or something, even though I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. I resolved not to let it ruin my day, but every little sound outside made me jumpy. That night, the noises returned, the same slow, rhythmic sound of footsteps. I listened from bed, my heart pounding in my chest. They were closer this time, right outside the cabin. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. I was too afraid of what I might see. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, praying it would stop. Eventually, it did, but I couldn't sleep afterward. My mind was consumed with thoughts of those footprints and how close they had been to my door. I felt like I was being watched. I got out of bed and checked all the locks on the doors and windows, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Finally, I sat by the fireplace, trying to forget everything, but the unease clung to me. The next morning, I decided to leave the cabin for a bit, thinking I might feel better if I got out and did something. I drove into town, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. I had lunch, wandered through a few shops, and tried to enjoy my day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching me, but whenever I turned around, no one was there. When I returned to the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold, more fresh footprints leading from the woods to my bedroom window. They were exactly the same size as the ones I had seen before, deep and clear in the mud. Someone had been standing right outside my window, looking in while I was gone. Panic surged through me, and I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to leave, but it was getting dark, and the idea of driving through the woods alone at night terrified me just as much. I decided to stay in the cabin, keeping all the lights on and locking every door and window. I grabbed a kitchen knife and held it close, just in case. I was on edge, jumping at every little sound. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat on the sofa, listening and waiting. The footsteps returned, slow and steady, circling the cabin. I could hear them moving, sometimes pausing as if trying to find a way in. I gripped the knife tightly, my hands shaking. I had no idea who they were or what they wanted, but I knew I wasn't alone. At one point, the footsteps stopped right outside the back door. I held my breath, waiting for what would happen next, but there was only silence, a heavy silence. Then the doorknob began to turn slowly, as if someone was checking to see if it was locked. My heart felt like it would explode. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The doorknob shook for a few more seconds before stopping. I heard nothing after that. The footsteps had vanished, but I knew they were still out there in the darkness, waiting. I spent the entire night wide awake, too terrified to move, too afraid even to look out the window. I imagined those muddy footprints and the person who had left them, standing right outside, just waiting for me to make a mistake. When the sun finally rose, I hurried to gather my things and leave the cabin as quickly as possible. I didn't care about the rest of the weekend, I just wanted to get away from there. I had rented a cabin in North Carolina for the weekend, just a little getaway from the city. It was a cozy place nestled in the woods, not far from Asheville. The pictures online looked amazing, and the host had good reviews, so I booked it without much thought. When I arrived, it was just as advertised, quiet, peaceful, surrounded by trees, perfect for a retreat. The host, a man in his 40s, met me when I arrived. He seemed friendly enough, maybe a bit too friendly, but nothing suspicious. He showed me around the cabin, pointing out the fireplace, the porch, and where to find extra towels. He also mentioned that he lived nearby, just down the road, if I needed anything. I nodded, eager to settle in and enjoy the solitude. The first night passed without incident. I cooked dinner, watched a movie, and finally fell asleep to the sound of rain on the roof. It was the relaxation I truly needed. But by the next day, things began to feel strange. I woke up late and decided to explore the cabin a bit more. It had an old-fashioned charm with creaky wooden floors and heavy wood furnishings. As I wandered around, I noticed a small door near the back of the bedroom. It was low to the ground, almost a crawl space, and painted the same color as the walls. I hadn't noticed it before. Curiosity took hold of me, so I tried the doorknob. It was locked. That struck me as odd. Why would there be a locked door in a rental home? I thought it might just be a storage area, but it kept haunting me throughout the day. That evening, as the rain began to fall harder, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin suddenly felt different, less welcoming. I kept glancing at that hidden door, imagining what could be behind it. Eventually, I couldn't stand it any longer. I had to see what was inside. I rummaged through the cabin looking for a key, thinking maybe the host had left one somewhere, but had no luck. Then I noticed a small gap between the door and the frame. I used a butter knife to pry it open, and after some effort, the lock clicked. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated, every instinct telling me, "Don't touch it," but I couldn't stop. I turned on my phone's flashlight and began to descend the stairs. The air grew colder as I went down, and the musty smell began to fill my nostrils. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were dozens of old photo albums. My heart raced as I pulled one down and opened it. The first pages were filled with pictures of various people, couples, families, all smiling in different rooms of the cabin. At first, they looked like normal vacation photos, but then I noticed something strange. The angles were skewed, as if they were taken through a crack in the wall or a hole in the ceiling. None of the people in the photos seemed to know they were being watched. I flipped through a few more pages, and the photos became even more unsettling. People were sleeping, changing clothes, completely unaware they were being photographed. My hands began to shake. I recognized some of the rooms in the cabin, the bedroom, the bathroom. My stomach churned as I realized I might have been photographed too. I wanted to leave right then, but I couldn't pull myself away. I opened another album, and it was even scarier. The people in these photos looked terrified, as if they knew they were being watched but couldn't figure out the source. Their eyes were wide, scanning the room, searching for something that made them uneasy. Some photos showed them trying to cover windows or block doors, and then, toward the end of the album, there were pictures of them leaving the cabin in a hurry, faces pale with fear. I slammed the album shut, my mind spinning. I had to get out of there. I stumbled back up the stairs, breathless, and when I reached the bedroom, I noticed something that froze my blood. The door was closed. I was sure I had left it open. I rushed to the front door, desperate to leave, but when I yanked it open, the host was standing there. His face wore a calm, almost serene expression, as if he knew exactly what I had found. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice smooth, too smooth. I stammered something about needing to leave, but he didn't move, just stood there blocking the exit with an intense gaze fixed on me. I could feel the pressure from his stare, the suffocating weight of the situation tightening around me. "I noticed that door was open," he said, his tone gentle as if we were discussing the weather. "That door was supposed to always be locked, you know." My heart raced so fast I thought it might explode. I tried to stay calm, to think of a way out, but he wasn't giving me much time. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "You shouldn't go down there," he said softly. "It's private." I stepped back, my mind racing to find an escape. The cabin suddenly felt cramped, stifling, the walls closing in on me as I realized I was trapped. "I think you should leave," I managed to say, my voice trembling. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think that's going to happen." In an instant, I lunged past him, using all my strength to shove him aside. He stumbled, caught off guard, and I yanked the door open again. I didn't look back as I sprinted into the rain, running like crazy down the muddy path toward my car. Fumbling with my keychain, my hands shaking, I finally managed to unlock the door. I jumped inside, started the engine, and sped away without a second thought. That morning started like any other. I ventured out early, seeking a few peaceful hours by the lake. Fishing alone was my escape, especially after a stressful week. The weather was perfect, a light mist hung over the water, and the chill was just right. I set up my gear and cast my line, savoring the tranquility around me. After a while, I noticed another fisherman not far away. He waved and smiled. I returned the gesture politely. He walked closer, fishing rod slung over his shoulder, cheerfully calling, "Good morning." I responded, trying to focus on my line. "You've got a nice spot there," he said, settling down nearby. "Mind if I join you?" "Not at all," I replied, though I secretly wished to be alone. He introduced himself as Mark and started chatting about fishing, the weather, and various small talk. I answered politely but kept my replies short. He seemed friendly enough, but I craved solitude. As time passed, Mark's friendliness began to feel intrusive. He kept asking personal questions about my life, where I lived, and what I did for a living. I gave vague responses, hoping he would take the hint. "Look over there," he suggested, pointing to a quieter area of the lake. "No, this spot is fine," I insisted, not wanting to move. "Come on, I've heard that place is fantastic," he pressed. "Thanks, but I think I'll stay here," I replied firmly. His demeanor shifted slightly. "Suit yourself," he mumbled, inching closer to me. Unease crept in, something about him felt off. His questions grew more personal and invasive. "Do you always come out here alone?" he asked, curiosity dripping from his tone. "Usually," I said, striving to maintain my composure. He stared at me for a moment, then smiled again, but this time his smile didn't reach his eyes. It's beautiful, isn't it? Just us and nature. Yeah, I replied, glancing at my phone. It was time to leave. I think I'll head out, I said, starting to pack my gear. Isn't it a bit early to leave? He asked, standing up. I have things to do, I replied, trying to sound casual. He stepped closer, blocking my path. Stay a little longer, it's not often you get good company out here. Panic rose within me. Really, I need to go, I insisted, my heart racing. He grabbed my arm. Stay, he said, his grip tightening. I yanked my arm away. Let go of me. I snapped, stepping back. His friendly facade shattered completely. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice low and menacing. I glanced around, searching for an escape route. The path to my car felt far away, and I doubted I could outrun him. Why are you doing this? I asked, trying to keep the conversation going while devising a plan. He shrugged. It's more fun with company, he said, advancing another step. I retreated, my mind racing. Suddenly, I remembered the knife in my tackle box. Hey, I don't want any trouble, I said, moving toward my gear. Too late for that, he said, lunging at me. I grabbed the knife and brandished it in front of me. He halted, eyes wide. Back off. I warned, holding the knife between us. He scoffed. You think that scares me? Back off. I repeated, my voice trembling. He charged again, and I slashed at his arm. He howled in pain but didn't stop. He barreled into me, knocking the knife from my grasp. We wrestled on the ground, and somehow I managed to kick him away. I sprang to my feet and sprinted toward my car, adrenaline surging through me. I could hear him behind me, shouting and cursing. I didn't look back, only focused on reaching my vehicle. Finally, I arrived, fumbling for my keys with trembling hands. I unlocked the door and jumped inside, locking it behind me. He pounded on the window, but I started the engine and sped off, my heart racing. I drove straight to the nearest town and headed to the police station. At the station, they took my statement and dispatched officers to the lake, but by the time they arrived, Mark had vanished without a trace.